Добрый день.
Good afternoon. Today, the Board of Directors made a decision to reduce the key rate by 25 basis points down to 4.5% per annum. At the upcoming meetings, we will consider the necessity of further key rate reduction. We have continued to ease monetary policy, primarily taking into account that the risks of the downward deviation of inflation from the 4% target in 2021 remain. These risks result from the slump in economic activity and the decline in domestic and external demand. According to our estimates, the recovery will take over 1.5 years, which will have a restraining effect on prices. I would like to stress that the specifics of the current moment is that the situation associated with the pandemic and the easing of the restrictions both in Russia and abroad in various regions and sectors is unfolding very non-uniformly. In June, the first half of July, when Russia started to ease its lockdown requirements, economic processes in the country were reviving, which included the recovery of power consumption, rebounding consumer and investment demand, the expansion of construction and consumer goods output, and a slower annual decline in freight turnover and industrial output. However, although businesses and household sentiment were improving overall, they remained cautious amid the persisting high uncertainty about how the situation might be unfolding further on. In June, the current monthly growth rates of consumer prices were significantly varying across different products and service groups due to the diverse impact of demand and supply side factors in individual markets. Nevertheless, overall inflationary pressures is weakening after an increase in March-April, which is evidenced by stable inflation indicators adjusted for one-off factors. Households and businesses' inflation expectations have stabilized overall after the decrease in May-June. Professional analysts have lowered their inflation expectations for the next year beneath 4%. We expect that the recovery pace in the economy and price dynamics will also remain non-uniform over the next few months, which may slightly obscure the developing trends. Nonetheless, in terms of the key rate decision and the prospects of monetary policy, it is more important to focus on the medium-term view on price and economic activity trends with account of sustainable factors. The economy will be returning to its potential progressively, and therefore disinflationary trends will prevail. We have adjusted our assumptions of the annual GDP change only slightly, taking into account the influence of divergent factors. On the one hand, this is a deeper decline in economic activity and in domestic and external demand in the second quarter, which resulted from the longer duration of the restrictions both in Russia and abroad than we had expected in April. According to our estimate, the GDP decrease in the second quarter equals 9–10%. On the other hand, we have observed a substantial expansion of the budget-funded and other measures supporting the economy compared to April, which is partially offsetting the decline in incomes and sustaining consumption and investment and boosting a faster economic rebound. In the updated forecast, we have reflected that fiscal stimulus has increased nearly twice compared to the measures that had been in place when April's forecast estimates were made. Moreover, economic recovery will also be promoted by the easing of monetary conditions owing to the significant reduction in the key rate. Taking into account these factors, according to our forecast, GDP will decline by 5.5% this year. Its recovery growth in the next 2 years is expected at the level of 3.5 to 4.5 and 2.5 to 3.5%. These estimates are mostly within the ranges we specified in April. As before, we expect that plummeting external demand, which will reduce export by 13–15%, will be the key drag on GDP in 2020. We also expect that the shrinkage of investment and consumption will be approximately equivalent this year, ranging from 6 to 8%. Although we forecast significant recovery growth in 2021, economic activity will remain considerably below its 2019 level and below the potential. This implies that the restraining effect of aggregate demand on consumer price trends will persist in the next year. The reduced current monthly rates of price growth will remain at this level until the end of the year. Inflation will be returning to the 4% target gradually, since it will take time for demand to recover, including owing to the easing of monetary policy. We forecast that annual inflation will range from 3.5 to 4% in 2021 and will stabilize close to 4% in 2022. I would like to remind you that inflation is expected to reach 3.7 to 4.2% by the end of this year. This is associated with two aspects. Firstly, annual inflation will rise from 3.2% in June, mostly because the low readings of the second half of 2019 will be excluded from the inflation calculations and not as a result of the current price growth rates. Secondly, the expected return of inflation to 4% by the end of the year will be driven by temporary pro-inflationary factors that impacted inflation in March and April. Without this temporary price growth acceleration, sustained inflationary pressure, as I have already said, stays at a reduced level below 4%. The reduction in the key rate since April is contributing to the further easing of monetary conditions. Interest rates in the banking sector are decreasing. However, we take into account that there are factors that may be restraining this process. These factors include increased credit risks and the resulting tightening of requirements for borrowers, as well as external factors that may cause risk premium fluctuations. Furthermore, we take into consideration that the regulatory easing and preferential lending programs are also contributing to the easing of monetary conditions today. Interest rates on deposits exceed the forecast inflation. Ruble-denominated household deposits keep growing. In June, their annual growth rate was 10.9%. The easing of monetary conditions driven by the actual key rate reduction will support credit growth already this year. We estimate that the credit to the economy will expand by 6 to 9% in 2020 and by 7 to 11% over the next 2 years. This will positively contribute to GDP dynamics. When making our decision to cut the key rate, we also take into account the announced plans with regard to the fiscal policy, including the forthcoming budget consolidation in 2021-2022. This year, the government has increased fiscal expenditures more significantly than it is provided by the fiscal rule. This has been done to support the economy and people in times of the powerful negative shock. And this is absolutely justified, especially at the initial stage of the crisis. At such a moment, the fiscal policy is able to aid the economy faster and more prominently than the monetary policy, whose influence becomes fully visible over a horizon from 3 to 6 quarters. At the same time, the current monetary policy easing will mainly influence inflation and economy dynamics over the next year, thereby offsetting the effect of the forthcoming budget consolidation. I would like to note that the fact that the government is planning to completely return to the fiscal parameters in 2022 is fundamentally important, not only for the long-term stability of public finance, but also for maintaining stable long-term interest rates in the economy and, therefore, for ensuring efficient operation of the transmission mechanisms of the monetary policy. Regarding the balance of payments in 2021, we expect a slight surplus of the current account around 2 to 3 billion US. This is a significant forecast revision as compared to April, when we expected that the current account balance would turn negative. This forecast adjustment is based on the following two factors. First, we have significantly reviewed our oil price assumptions upwards from $27 to $38 per barrel in 2020 and from $35 to $40 $85 per barrel in 2021 on the back of the oil price recovery owing to the OPEC Plus deal. This is reflected in high export forecast. Second, it is a more prolonged decline in services imports, which took place in the second quarter due to closed borders, suspended travel services, and the switch to domestic consumption. These restrictions may partially stay in place further in this year. The increase in the expected negative balance of the financial account of the private sector is mainly related to the current account forecast revision. The forecast of the balance of payments also takes into account the plans of the Ministry of Finance to increase borrowing this year. Compared to the April forecast, we expect a less significant decline in foreign currency reserves in 2020-2021, considering oil price changes and the amount of operations under the fiscal rule. The forecast of operations under the fiscal rule includes the completion of sale of foreign currency related to the deal with Bank shares. The mechanism under which we sell this currency only if the price of Urals oil is below $25 expires on 30th of September. If the current situation in the global oil market remains in August-September, we are planning to offset the balance of unsold foreign currency related to Bank shares with the amounts of purchases postponed since 2018 and preemptive sales that we conducted in March-April. The net balance is 185 billion rubles in the ruble equivalent. This amount of foreign currency will be evenly sold in addition to regular fiscal rule-based operations over the course of the fourth quarter of 2020. Speaking about forecast risk factors, uncertainty remains high, both in terms of the nature of the slowdown and recovery processes in the Russian and global economies, and in terms of the scale of the effect that the pandemic and restrictive measures could have on the economic growth potential in Russia and abroad. This concerns both the production recovery potential and possible changes in household consumers and saving preferences. These factors, in turn, can have a considerable effect on the inflation forecast. Uncertainty caused by external conditions is further exacerbated by increased tension between the US and China, which creates risks to both global economic growth and the dynamics of global commodity and financial markets. There remain risks on the part of other geopolitical factors as well. Besides, at the current stage, with the restrictions still in place, it is difficult to unambiguously estimate how quickly and widely the key rate reduction will translate into the easing of monetary conditions and further on into the dynamics of economic activity and inflation. As we have noted earlier, in the near future, there will be influenced by a wide range of diverse factors. I would like to point out that at our today's meeting, we have returned to our standard key rate change pace, considering the finer tuning of the monetary policy within the baseline forecast is necessary now as compared to the previous months, when a decisive response on the side of the monetary policy to shocks was justified. In the future, we will estimate the nature of changes in monetary conditions, recovery processes in the economy, and price dynamics, and based on these factors, consider the necessity to cut the key rate at the upcoming meetings. In general, we believe that there may still be room for monetary policy easing. When making our key rate decision, we also discussed the neutral key rate range. At the current stage, we have reviewed our real neutral key rate range downwards to 1–2% from 2 to 3%. This means that the nominal neutral interest rate change range declines to 5 to 6%, taking into account the annual inflation target close to 4%. The adjustment of the neutral interest rate estimate is primarily related to changes in external factors, including the formation of interest rates in the global economy at lower level. We also took into account the decrease of the country risk premium. That said, I would like to remind you that a neutral rate of interest is basically a virtual indicator which cannot be directly observed and depends on a very wide range of factors. The estimate of the neutral interest rate range is based on a comprehensive analysis that we provided to us. In conclusion, let me reiterate that we make our monetary policy decisions primarily based on our objective to stabilize inflation close to the 4% target. Thank you very much. And before I begin answering your questions, I would also like to say a few words about other decisions that the Board of Directors made today with respect to a number of regulatory easings in the banking sector to support a quicker economic recovery. And the first decision was an accelerated introduction of a new method for assessment of the mortgage credit risk, which would enable, as we believe, to release almost 300 billion rules of capital from the banks for mortgage lending. We used to mention it before. Second, stimulating the investment programs in the biggest companies by creating more favorable conditions to acquire term-less bonds. This is a temporary measure to improve investment activity during the recovery period over the next few years. The risk rate in terms of the investments into the subordinated debts will be reduced from 150 to a lower level. The third is helping the banks to regulate the distressed loans in the systemic companies by receiving compensation from the company or having the stock of this company collateralized. So effectively, this is exchanging debt for capital. This is also a temporary benefit for 2 years' time in order to incentivize these kinds of settlements. We understand that many borrowers are finding themselves quite hard. The decline was very deep, and in order to ease the pressure upon the financial sector, we are taking these measures temporarily until the middle of 2022. The risk ratio in terms of the investment into the stock of the systemic companies will be subject to such arrangements, and they will be reduced from 150 to 100%. With the same purpose in mind, we are deferring for 1 year, raising the risk in terms of banks' investment into the non-financial capital, which will stimulate the banks to support the manufacturing sector and will give bigger time to the banks in order to reduce their share investments into the stock which are not generating any interest income. We're also deferring the risk ratios for the default debt by 12 months compared to the original schedule in order to cushion the period during which the distressed debt may manifest itself and inevitably would create difficulties, as well as because of the pandemic difficulties. Another change in order to make our high-tech products more competitive for foreign buyers, and in this way support the recovery of the external demand, we have reduced the risk ratio from 20% down to 0 for the lending into non-commodity exporters with XR coverage. Thank you very much. And now I will be ready to answer your questions. I am ready to answer your questions, and the first question comes from Elena Fabricna from Reuters. Has the August factor, which is a traditionally cumbersome month for Russia, upon the current Board of Directors decision? Well, our decision was under the effect of our analysis of what is happening in the economy, what kind of trends are evolving, and most importantly, with our decisions, we are trying to impact the future. And like I've said, and every time I'm saying it, our decisions do take effect with a bit of a lag, and so it is being affected by the kind of a forecast of what kind of trends we do see for the forthcoming period, because we've updated our forecast at one of our core meetings, have updated our forecast, and based on that, we made a decision for no other additional factors that you might have in mind. So, next question, please. Dmitry Buterin from Kommersant. Hello, Dmitry. Yes, hello. I don't know how this works. I've got a simple question. What are the fiscal consolidation parameters for the next couple of years in terms of This is also a temporary benefit for 2 years in order to stimulate this kind of a settlement. Oh, Dmitry, I'm sorry. This is not me. I mean, it's me speaking, but it's a replay of the previous statement. So you asked about what kind of budget consolidation parameters we took into account. We took the ones which are currently being considered by the Ministry of Finance, assuming that by 2022 we will switch over to the fiscal rule. When we were looking into it in April, I mean the budget effect upon our decisions, first of all, at that point in time we expected weaker budget measures for 2020. We have updated those, and so quite naturally we've also assessed the new borrowing program as well as the additional borrowings took into account. But in as far as the 2021 period is concerned, there will be a gradual fiscal consolidation so that by 2022 to switch to the fiscal rule guidelines. But we believe that this is exactly the kind of period of time when the fiscal consolidation is going to take place. I mean, 2021, there will begin manifesting itself, this effect from the fiscal and monetary policy easing only then. I mean, the one that has taken place this year. Thank you very much. Maria Stepanova from TASS Agency, please. Good afternoon. I've got a question about the repo options, because this week no long-term options auctions took place for the next year. Does the regulator see further the need to hold such auctions? Yes, thank you very much for your question. But even when we were introducing these auctions on a longer-term footing, you may remember that you always used to say that you won't see any problem with the liquidity in the banking sector, because we acknowledge that as being comfortable, but simply because there were quite a few concerns, and the banks had to go in for quite a lot of restructurings in order for them to feel this liquidity comfort. We have introduced these instruments. It was well expected. There is no demand for them, but in the meantime, we do plan to retain them in order to provide for this comfort to remain with respect to this liquidity, so that the banks could feel themselves better off and more relaxed, because we're still going through the economic recovery period. Ekaterina Belkina from Interfax. Good afternoon. Go ahead. Yes, good afternoon. I would like to find out the following thing. The central bank recommended to the banks, if they do go for the regulatory easy, to delay some dividend decisions. There were very few banks which actually had paid it, but do you have an expectation as to how many banks made a decision to delay their dividend action, and how many of them decided to use the fiscal easing and regulatory easing? And another question, do you believe that the major banks will reconsider downward their dividend policy in terms of their ratio to the net profit? And my second question, again about acquiring, which is the acquiring interest, acquiring fee, because the central bank has the right to limit it. Do we intend to do that? Thank you very much for the questions. In as far as dividends are concerned, indeed, we have recommended during this period, difficult period, to delay any decisions to be made with respect to the dividend paid by the banks until August, September. But nevertheless, some banks went ahead and made a decision in terms of the number. This is about 10% from all of the banks. Amongst them, there isn't a single major systemically important bank. And the decisions that they made about dividend payment overall throughout the banking sector, that would be 25 billion rubles, not a significant value. So that is something that won't seriously affect the banking sector position. Different banks differently use these easing measures, because we are currently analyzing what kind of regulatory easing measures were more sought after, which were not, and to what extent the banks are ready to gradually come out of this easing area. So we are analyzing it, and sometime by the middle of next month, we will let the public and the banking sector know how we intend to step by step leave this easing pattern But the banks which resorted to these easing indeed are not paying dividends, and amongst other things were also issued guidelines with respect to the bonus payment to the top management by recommending to grow the quantity of deferred compensations by the individuals who make such decisions. In as far as the August and September decisions are concerned, to be made by major banks, also every bank will have to consider its individual status so as to understand what is going on with their balance and how and what is the way that the credit quality changes, whether it worsens, how's restructuring going on, to assess the capital adequacy for the future, and based on that, make a decision whether they're in a position to pay the dividends for the previous year. I do not rule out that a number of banks will give up entirely paying the dividends due or will reduce the level. But that will be done on the basis of an analysis by every and each bank, and would also take a very scrutinous look at it. As far as acquiring is concerned, we made a decision we have used our right that the legislature gave us to limit the acquiring fees for online transactions, and we did it at the point in time during the period when there were various restrictions in place and self-isolation, the lockdown, so that people wouldn't have to go out of homes more than necessary. And so that particular acquiring service was very much demanded. And in the meantime, we are rather inclined not to expand on these restrictions. Why? Because we do see that it has positively impacted an individual's and households' ability to go for such online transactions. But we also see that the banks started curtailing certain loyalty programs for consumers, and we think that there are certain negatives. This acquiring fee restrictions is not creating over the blanket positive effects. So that is why we believe that one should move on by creating competition, by developing competition in between different payment systems in this way to allow the market to go down in terms of the transactional costs. The next question by Andrei Birikov from Bloomberg. Hello, Andrei. Yes, hello, Elvira Nabiullina. The government is debating the necessity to introduce the oil price hedging mechanisms like, for example, is being done in Mexico. Do you believe it really would be worthwhile for Russia? And how this can be dovetailed with the fiscal rule? We haven't yet seen any specific ideas on the subject. But if I am to say whether we should or we should not copy the Mexican experience, we're not supportive of it. In the first place, we do believe that the fiscal rule is doing a good job. To change it for something different, you must understand that this different mechanism is going to be better. We're not totally convinced in this. To add it with something, you must understand what is the price to be paid for this new edition. But apart from that, you need to also take into account the fact that the oil output and the exports of oil in Mexico are multiply lower than what Russia does. And if you are talking about hedging all of the volumes, we are very much doubtful that the hedging markets would allow for this transaction to go through. Otherwise, it will be very much costly. But if you expect it to be funded from the National Endowment Fund, it's not the best way to spend public money, really. That would be very dear against such a volume to be covered. And you also have to consider that the current way the National Welfare Fund is being used calls for the investment return principles, and it is not going to be followed completely in such a case. So at this point in time, we're not supporting this proposal as we understand it. The next question from Anastasia Soprikina from RIA Novosti. Do you see any potential for further reduction of the key rate in 2020? We do allow for such a potential to remain, but we will be keeping a close hand on the situation out of the processes taking place, out of the data that we're receiving, because there are so many uncertainties still at play. But on the other hand, we do see that disinflationary factors will prevail until the end of this year as a minimum, and next year there will also be there because there is a decline in demand, but on top of it, we will have to assess the results of the easing of the monetary policy that has already taken place, and we have undertaken quite a few steps which are distributed in time. So whether there is such potential, what kind of this potential is, it requires a detailed and scrutinous analysis, taking into account the way the situation further will unfold. Anastasia Savelieva, Interfax, hello. Yes, good afternoon. I wanted to ask, when do you feel there might come such an oil price when the central bank, as part of the fiscal rule and directed by the Minister of Finance, will move from the currency acquisition to selling it, and that 185 billion rubles that has remained, I mean, that surplus that you might be selling in the course of the fourth quarter, how are you going to record it? Are you going to sell it, or you will be able to offset it depending upon the way these transactions go? This is my first question. And my second question, it is considered that there is a slight economic recovery after April, May, but this recovery in the economy, could it sustain itself in the fourth quarter, or by the beginning of next year it may fall down? Maybe you believe that some additional measures are required from the government and the central bank to support the economy further. Thank you. Based on our base forecast, if the LIFE follows it, we will go about purchasing the currency according to the fiscal rule in 2022, because our oil price forecast for 2022 is $45 per barrel. As far as the 185 billion rubles are concerned, again, if the whole environment evolves according to our basic scenario, we are going to sell it. I mean, the currency evenly in the course of the fourth quarter. We want to sell it before the end of this year. And with regards to the future dynamics, we do not expect that in Q4 the recovery will start slowing. We expect that the Russian economy will continue rebounding. Additional measures, at this point in time, we do not feel that they are necessary, because the basic measures instituted by the government in the first place will continue to generate effect this year, almost towards the very end of it, and these are big, serious stimulus, which continues to support the economic activity. Next question, a very common, very popular question, because we remember seeing it coming from several media. Ryazan, City Panorama, the Nizhny Novgorod Portal Banks, and then the Business St. Petersburg, the South Urals Panorama from Chelyabinsk, and it is as follows. The reduction of the key rates is usually being followed by the reduction of the banking rates. Are the banks against such a situation are not running a risk of an outflow of capital? And does the central bank take such risks into account when making its decisions? Without doubt, we do sternly follow all of the rates in the economy, deposit or lending rates and whatnot. Whenever we ease our credit policy, I'm sure that the majority are cognizant of the fact that the lending rates go down due to the fact that there would be a greater availability of lending, but surely during the same kind of period the deposit rate also follows suit, but at a different pace. And right now, the deposit rates, we believe, are above the inflation forecast. I mean, they remain positive, and we do see, considering the banking deposits dynamics, that they continue to grow. Yes, in April, May, there was a bit of a decline. You may remember we explained it by saying that against the lockdowns, of course, people were withdrawing money in order to be able to handle their needs, but immediately. But after that, we were able to see these deposits to recover. And it is certainly important when making a decision to see what's going on in the deposit realm as well as in the lending rate realm, because we do know that the banks are also very watchful over the level of attraction of liabilities from households, and based on that do follow their own interest policy. And indeed, this is one of the drivers which we do take into account when making up our minds about the key rates. The next question, please, Tatiana Bochkaryova from Izvestia. Hello. Yes, good afternoon. My question is partially related to the previous one, and it is also about the deposit rates. Towards the end of the autumn last year, there was an issue raised that possibly negative deposit rates were going to be introduced. At least the banks were very much eager to have them, as we remember them saying. And simply because right now we're going into a very prolonged, difficult crisis, and hardly likely the central banks would make their policies tougher, I want to ask, are you not thinking of going back to a situation whereby at the legislative level you may change the requirements imposed upon the banks to pay positive income? Oh, I see. You mean the negative rates on the currency deposits, because that exactly was the topic discussed in the last year. Yes, exactly, because based on what we see, the deposits generate positive income. Yes, of course, we've considered different ends and ways, including amendments into the legislation, but we considered it was not really worth it then, first of all, because the problem of the negative rates for the banks, it was not a massive one. And the banks were able to deal with these problems by switching more to the current accounts and offering current accounts, by introducing certain fees related to it. Right now, I don't have any information at my fingertips which would tell me that we might be reconsidering this approach. We really don't see any need to introduce legislative changes, but we will certainly be very much following the way this whole thing develops. But the policy of negative rates in rubles, we are not intending to institute. We are talking right now only about the currency deposits. Of course, because of various central banks' decisions in the US, in the first place, in the European Union. The next question from Evgenia Ogrosova from Bank.ru. Is it probable that during the September Board of Directors meetings you will further reduce the key rate? And will you be ever doing it more than simply by 25 basis points? Once again, let me underscore that there is possibly a certain space for additional easing of the monetary policy. Now, to what extent one will be in a position to use it, we will consider based upon the way the economy is faring and based upon all of the data and information that we received. Within the base forecast, we would rather say that we are back to our standard pace because, you know, we actually prefer to act in a gradual way, in a much smoother way, in order to be able to assess all of the effects from what we decide, but a step or a pace above a standard one, we go for it only when the environment changes very seriously, and which forces us also to reconsider our own forecast, which means that we have to adjust our monetary policy in a much more weighted way, and that is the progression that we are going to follow. Anastasia from the Bell. Hello, Anastasia the Bell. From the Bell. Stagnate from the Bell. Yes, hello. I wanted to ask you a question. This year, there are two countries, UK and US, have announced another plans to introduce sanctions against Russia. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you believe these plans are serious, and are you considering that as an additional risk, posing an additional risk to the ruble? Well, the seriousness of any sanctional plans is something that we long cease to assess because this is really a very ungrateful thing to do. But every time when we put together our forecast and making our decisions, we're trying to act conservatively, basically understanding that this is the kind of risks that may always manifest itself, but most importantly, for us to have the necessary toolkit to use in case such risks do come. And we do pursue a policy which takes into account the financial stability, lesser vulnerability of our economy to external shocks, including such geopolitical activities. And that is the top priorities within our policy so as to avoid any unexpected negative consequences. The next question from Elena Fabrichnaya from the Reuters. Does the central bank think to go back to purchasing gold, or the growing exports demonstrated the decisions that the previously central bank took and is not going to revive its gold acquisition? Well, friends, you know, we usually do not comment on our plans with respect to the hard currency and gold reserves, but I principally can say we've got enough gold in order to ensure diversification of our gold and hard currency reserves. And the fact that we stopped buying gold, and you remember that there were quite a few concerns voiced about the extent to which such a stoppage can be compensated by the exports of gold, because we do see that the gold exports is growing quite nicely and generating additional currency income into the country. So everything is quite all right here. And next is Anton Feinberg from RBK. What can be explained the growing cash transactions further? What are the economic entities which are requiring cash to be transacted because the individuals stopped withdrawing their money from the banks? Do you believe that some money in the economy would go into the grey zone against the crisis? Well, indeed, the demand for cash money at the regional stage was something, and that was exactly the case. We explained that people are trying to stock up cash for the period of lockdown. I'm sure that in many cases these people have brought their money back to the banks. In other cases, they still have them. Secondly, the demand for cash also was impacted by changes in the travel industry. We were able to see that the foreign traveling fell. The domestic travel has come up quite tangibly, and very often can be explained that people traveling within the country do tie cash with them because that is one of the reasons. And quite possibly this is the explanation that can be followed simply because the economic entities currently, for the purposes of settlements between themselves and the personnel, started resorting to cash payment more and more. This in itself requires additional analysis. We are monitoring it. We will continue to look out for it just to understand what's going to be the cash payment dynamics and what is impacting it. Evgenia Pismina from Bloomberg, hello. Yes, hello. I've got two questions. One about household incomes. Basically speaking, the Russian Statistical Agency demonstrated that in Q2 the household incomes went down by 8%, and that was the biggest decline since 2018 until the quarterly pace. Even despite all of the government support and payments to the households with kids at 10 rubles per child, which took place during the second quarter, nobody's expecting any more money coming to help them. So what do you think about the further risks of household income going further down? And do you take into account any consequences? Are you taking into account this as a factor? Are you not afraid that the rate is currently at an historic low minimum and people will simply rush into the banks and then won't be able to pay because they won't have any money left? So this is my first very long question. My second question is a short one. We're still arguing between ourselves. What's on your pin, on your jacket? It's a letter V and a horseshoe. What do they all mean? All right, as far as the second question is concerned, if I go for an explanation, you will feel bored because there could be different interpretations. Now, as far as the household incomes are concerned, yes, indeed, in the current environment and against a very dramatic decline in economic activity, based on our estimates, the GDP in Q2 fell down by 9 to 10%. That's what happened, and consequently, the incomes also fell. They have been partially compensated for by large-scale initiatives launched by the government. Of course, not all of the income declined. The basic recovery of incomes should be linked to the economic activity recovery, and the second quarter here cannot be extrapolated into the future. In our base forecast, we do expect the economy to recover. We do see that it will recover, fully recover in terms of the household incomes. That will certainly take some time, and that is why the support measures, they also have a certain time lag effect, as well as the support for the wages. This year they are in place, and they would be deferred into the next year, carried forward. They're not going to stop immediately, so we do say that these are the basic measures that would sustain the incomes during the economic period of economic recovery. We do take into account potential household income recovery when we make our decisions. Yes, we do acknowledge that the consumer lending is recovering much better than what we expected in April, because you may recall, April, our forecast was that the consumer lending this year might fall down by some 5%. Now we believe that it will grow this year by 4 to 5%, because households are taking more loans and borrowing more. And so in terms of our regulation, we have certain consumer lending buffers that we have accumulated worth some 600 billion rubles. And so we're trying to see when the banks are going to actively register losses with respect to these loans, because there is a certain payment vacation. And so some of the buffers is what we can gradually let go. But at the same time, we're not going to give up on the regulation which is related to the marginal household debt burden. This regulation must remain in place, because it shouldn't be, it shouldn't force people to really take as many debts as possible and fall into the debt pit. So one will have to be really very attentive in terms of adjusting our regulation, correcting it, fine-tuning it, in order to avoid this excessive lending. So we will definitely be working on that. But the consumer loans will definitely be recovering, and this way support the economic growth and support the consumer activity. Julia Makarova, Russia 24. Hello. Hello, Elvira Nabiullina. You said that the Bank of Russia reduces its neutral rate range. What does it mean in the minds of the public, for the end consumers, for consumers? Is something going to change, or that is exclusively, something that the financial market has already took account of? The neutral rate. Well, let me begin by once again emphasizing this is quite a relative indicator. It's not something that we monitor as part of our everyday work. It is an indicator which points to where the rate should be against the inflation being at target, and we've got it at 4%, so as to avoid any significant deviation in terms of the GDP and employment dependence upon the potential. And we are taking into account as one of the factors in this list, in the board of directors, what it thinks in terms of where this neutral rate should be, how it can behave when making up our minds. But this is not only the single driver, because you can pursue a soft monetary policy when the rate is below the range that we identify as a neutral. But overall, if you talk about what the neutral rate may affect, it rather sets a certain range, a certain destination within which a key rate may remain as an average within a longer period of time. So the next question, please. Anna Kalidina from Izvestia. Nowadays, a lot is being said about the second pandemic wave. Is regulator getting ready for such an outcome? If so, how? We consider different risks within our basic forecast, without doubt. And such risks are out there. And first of all, we do see in many other countries that risks of the second wave may come. But like many experts and analysts do say, even if such risks happens, we are better prepared, and it will hardly be related to the same level of restrictions. On top of it, we do know that there is some very active work going on in the vaccine development. So certainly, something as a risk we always do take into account, particularly now. There are so many uncertainties, so many risks floating by. We are cognizant of them, and that is why we prefer to move step by step. With regard to this particular risks, in our scenario, we will share them in the main guidelines of the monetary fiscal policy, which in September we will start discussing, and so you will see our presentation about what such risks could be. Mikhail Paramonov, Plus magazine. What's the Bank of Russia attitude towards the draft law about suspending the utility services payment fee? Yes, we do support this particular draft, particularly the people who have to pay for such services. This fee becomes some sort of an imputed payment for people who have to pay for such kind of service. But at the same time, we do believe it is important to understand who and how, at whose expense, through which way, may compensate the banks for the expenses that banks inevitably will incur when administering these kinds of transactions. Next question from Dmitry Petruchin, Nikar telechannel from Kaluga. Is the Bank of Russia planning to make announcement about the forward guidance of the future key rate, like the practices in some other countries? Yes, indeed, there is such a practice in some countries, and we continuously hear requests to come out with a greater predictability about our monetary policy by, amongst other things, publishing the trajectory of the key rate. We are very much trying hard to be predictable, and we are trying as much as we can to publish various reports to share the rationale that we're following so that everyone could understand why we are thinking this or that way. But indeed, there is also an approach whereby the regulators publish their ideas about the way the key rate may behave. We continue to debate it. We continue to also discuss the format that such publications could be put into in terms of the future key rates movement. There are different approaches to it, and so we want to come to the one which would enable us to properly and correctly interpret such a publication. It is utterly important in order for this not to be perceived as something obligatory. Whilst later on, situation may change and the central bank might be forced to adjust its monetary policy, for this not to turn out to be an utter surprise to the economic entities. And so with this in mind, we are looking for such a format, and I guess that this whole thing is what we will definitely debate in detail during the discussion of the main monetary policy guidelines. I mean, the format which would enable one to consider the whole spectrum of variations that the Board of Directors looks into. Believe me, whenever we discuss the key rate, we do consider and discuss very actively the way various risks and various events may develop, and because it is impossible to imagine it fitting into one particular line. So once we come to this understanding, we might start sharing it out in the form of publication. Thank you very much. That was the last question. I am very, very grateful to all of you for your attention, for your patience, and for your questions. Thank you.